I must have been 8, maybe 9 when it happened, young enough that bedtime stories still held some sway over my imagination, but old enough to understand that the world could be dangerous. What I didn't realize until much later was how thin the barrier between normal life and sheer terror really was. How fast a single night could turn from ordinary to unforgettable. It was deep in the heart of winter, during one of those notorious Midwest blizzards that made everything look like a snow globe gone berserk. School had stayed open that day, somehow, despite the snow stacking up against the classroom windows and the sky turning into a solid white sheet. I remember being bundled in layers of itchy wool and thick gloves, my breath coming out in frosty clouds as my dad came to pick me up. He looked annoyed at the weather, but tried to play it off with a smile. That evening, he and my mom were scheduled to attend a retirement dinner for one of his old mentors. It was supposed to be a quick event in a neighboring town just 25 minutes away, under normal driving conditions. But of course, nothing about that night was normal. The snow came down harder after dark, like the sky was trying to bury us alive. The wind howled like some lonely thing looking for a way in. Before they left, Mom had knelt in front of me in the hallway, adjusting the scarf around my neck, even though I wasn't going outside. "We'll be back tonight, promise," she said, smoothing my hair with one gloved hand. "Just a few hours. You'll be fine, sweetheart. You're so grown up now." I grinned, trying to look responsible, though I was already giddy at the idea of having the house to myself. She handed me a sheet of paper before they left. "Just in case we get delayed. It's really important you follow this, okay?" I nodded and stuffed the note into the pocket of my pajama pants without really looking at it. I remember being more interested in what frozen food I could microwave without adult supervision. The list was short. Keep the hallway light on. Lock every door and window. Double-check them all. Do not, under any circumstances, go into the basement. At the time, that last one barely registered. I didn't ask questions. Our basement was creepy anyway, unfinished, always musty, and filled with the kind of clutter that made your eyes play tricks on you. Bins of decorations, ancient furniture, a workbench with rusty tools. I never liked going down there. If anything, I was glad for the excuse to stay away. They left around 6:30 p.m. I remember standing at the window and watching their taillights disappear into the whiteout, wondering what kind of food they'd be eating and whether I could get away with eating ice cream straight from the carton. The wind howled and clawed at the sides of the house like it had fists. I made myself a personal pizza, burned the crust, and scarfed it down while watching a rerun of some sitcom I barely understood. By 9 p.m., the snow outside had become a solid wall of white. I curled up under a thick blanket on the living room couch and watched the wind whip around the porch lights, hypnotized. At some point, the world just faded out. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, the house was dark. Not just dim, completely, utterly dark. The TV had turned off. No hum from the refrigerator, no buzz from the heater vents. Just the kind of silence that feels wrong. The flashlight we kept in the kitchen drawer suddenly felt like the most important object in the world. The air inside the house was freezing. I could see my breath. Stiff from sleep and confused, I sat up, wrapped the blanket tighter around me, and started doing what I should have done hours earlier. I pulled out the crumpled list and followed it to the letter. Locked the back door, checked the windows, turned the hallway light back on, though it did nothing because the power was still out. But the basement was a different matter. I had no intention of opening that door. I didn't even look at it when I passed it the first time, like avoiding eye contact with something dangerous. But as I walked back into the kitchen to grab some extra batteries for the flashlight, something strange caught my attention. The heat, or rather the lack of it. Even accounting for a broken heater, the cold in the house didn't feel natural. It wasn't just the absence of warmth, it felt like something had replaced it. A presence. Something heavy, silent, watching. And as I stood there in the center of the kitchen, I realized it was warmest right where I was standing, directly above the basement door. That's when I noticed it. A sound. Subtle, barely audible above the wind outside. Breathing. Deep. Raspy. Inconsistent. It wasn't mine. It was coming from below. I tiptoed over to the door and pressed my ear against it, convinced it was my imagination. But it was real. I heard it, A slow inhale, then a wheezy exhale, as if something or someone was standing on the bottom step just behind the door, waiting. My heart tried to claw its way out of my chest. I backed away slowly, quietly, and turned off the flashlight. My instinct was to hide. But where? Every room suddenly felt too open, too exposed. I couldn't go upstairs, not with the stairs creaking the way they did. So instead, I crawled under the dining room table, curling into myself like a frightened animal. And I waited. Time passed like molasses. I kept my eyes locked on the basement door from my hiding spot. Every gust of wind against the walls made me flinch. My ears strained for any hint of movement, but for a long time nothing happened. Then it did. The doorknob started to turn, slowly, deliberately. Not the way someone checks a door to see if it's locked, but the way you open something when you already know what's on the other side. The door creaked open. The breathing grew louder. I shoved my fists into my mouth to keep from screaming. Heavy footsteps began to climb the stairs one at a time. No hesitation, no uncertainty. And then I saw them. 2 bare feet stepped into view from where I hid, wet, pale, caked with grime and blood, with long slashes and open cuts on the shins. They didn't move like normal feet. They dragged, shuffled, stumbled forward like they were attached to someone learning how to walk again, or pretending. Whoever it was, whatever it was, they stopped just a few feet from me and dropped something. A wrench. It hit the tile with a loud metallic clatter. If they bent down to retrieve it, they'd see me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The figure didn't bend down. They stood there swaying slightly, then slowly turned and limped across the living room. I listened to their steps, the irregular thud of bare heels against tile and carpet, and watched, paralyzed, as the front door opened and shut. They were gone, or so I hoped. I stayed under that table for what felt like hours. My body ached. My fingers had gone numb. Eventually, when the sun began to rise and the snowstorm broke, I dared to crawl out. The wrench was still there, lying like a discarded warning on the floor. I picked it up with shaking hands and shoved it deep into the kitchen drawer. The basement door stood wide open, and at the foot of the stairs I saw a wet outline on the concrete, like someone had stood there for a long time, dripping water. I never told my parents, not until years later, when we were cleaning out the attic and found that the same wrench covered in rust. Even then, I framed the story like it was a weird dream or a prank I imagined. But I'll never forget that night. Never. The cold, the breathing, the feet, and the one rule I should have taken more seriously. Don't go near the basement. I was 17 the night it happened, and even now, years later, I still find myself lying awake sometimes, staring at the ceiling, listening for a sound that should never return. I live with my parents in a quiet old neighborhood tucked at the edge of a sleepy town, the kind of place where every face is familiar and the street lamps flicker like they're stuck in time. It's the kind of place people describe as safe, predictable, unchanging. But the truth is, even the safest places can turn unrecognizable in the rain. It was early summer, one of those in-between Saturdays in late May, where the season is unsure of itself. The sun had disappeared hours ago, and a storm had moved in fast and hard. We're no strangers to rain around here, but this one was relentless. Sheets of water hammering the roof, the wind clawing at the windows, and the gutters spilling over like miniature waterfalls. The rain sounded almost alive. Now let me say this. I've always had a rough relationship with sleep. I'm one of those people who needs silence, pure silence. Even a ticking clock or the low hum of a ceiling fan is enough to keep me awake. And that storm, it was a sensory nightmare. I'd already tried everything. Reading, stretching, even breathing exercises my therapist had taught me. But nothing worked. It was close to 2 a.m., and my nerves were so tight I felt like a snapped wire. I remember sitting up in bed, staring into the darkness, my heart racing for no reason at all, or maybe for a reason I just hadn't seen yet. Eventually, I gave up trying to sleep and decided to step outside for a walk. I had done it before, usually during stressful nights when my mind wouldn't shut off. My parents were deep sleepers, and I knew how to creep down the stairs without making a sound. I threw on a hoodie and raincoat and slipped out the front door, letting the storm swallow me whole. Our house backs up to a long stretch of protected parkland, mostly trees, wide open grass fields, and a paved loop that circles a dry retention pond. It's a popular walking path during the day, but I'd walked it many times at night too. And honestly, I'd always found something oddly calming about the way the park looked in the rain, how the street lights carved long golden spears through the mist. That night I left my phone behind. I told myself it was to protect it from the rain, but in truth, I didn't want the distraction. I wanted to be present, completely immersed. The storm had a rhythm to it. Wind, rain, wind, rain. The pattern lulled me into a weird headspace, a kind of detached peace. I walked for maybe 15 minutes, letting the cold water seep into my sleeves until I started to feel, not sleepy exactly, but heavy, as if the storm was draining the energy right out of me. I turned to head back home, tracing the same path I'd come in on. But as I neared the sidewalk that bordered the outer edge of the park, I noticed something, a shape. It was lying motionless in the middle of the road. I stopped walking. From that distance, I couldn't tell what it was. A pile of clothes, maybe? Or some animal that had been hit by a car. My brain immediately jumped to the safest conclusions. A fallen garbage bin, maybe? A broken tree branch. But none of those things had limbs. The figure was human, face down, arms slack at their sides, rain pouring over them like they weren't even there. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to walk away, to pretend I hadn't seen anything. But I couldn't. It wasn't how I was raised. If there was even the slightest chance that person needed help, I had to check. I stepped off the curb and began to approach the body, my footsteps sloshing quietly in puddles. That's when I heard it, a sound from behind me, a high-pitched guttural wail, like metal tearing, or a scream trapped inside an echo chamber. It came from deep in the trees behind the park. It didn't sound human, and it didn't sound animal either. I froze. For a moment I stood there, blinking against the rain, staring into the trees. But there was nothing, just shadows and branches swaying wildly in the wind. Still that noise, it planted something dark in my chest. I turned back to the road only to find the figure wasn't lying down anymore. He was sitting upright, head tilted, arms resting loosely on his knees. He was staring directly at me. My mouth went dry. My legs turned to liquid. The fear that washed over me wasn't the typical jolt of adrenaline you get from a jump scare. It was deeper, primal, ancient, like something in my brain recognized the scene in front of me as a threat from a time before language. The man stood up. He was tall, gaunt, soaking wet. His clothes hung off him like drapes. In one hand, he held something long and reflective. It took my eyes a moment to process that it was a knife, something from a kitchen by the looks of it. Long and sharp and completely out of place. He smiled. There was nothing friendly in it. His eyes were wide and unfocused, like someone whose mind had been left behind. Then, with no warning, he started running, full speed straight at me. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't look back. I just ran, feet slipping across the wet pavement, heart thundering in my ears. I veered off the path and into the grass, aiming for the denser part of the park. I didn't want to lead him to my house. That was the only clear thought in my head. I couldn't risk him knowing where I lived. The storm had turned the grass into a swamp, and every step felt like running through molasses. I could hear him behind me, his feet crashing against the earth, his breath sharp and animalistic. He shouted something, but the storm swallowed the words. All I heard was rage, pure, violent rage. I darted into the woods. Branches scratched at my arms and face. Mud sprayed up my legs. My lungs burned. I didn't know where I was going. I just kept moving, weaving between trees until I couldn't hear him anymore. Finally, when I was sure I would collapse, I ducked behind the thick trunk of a pine tree and stayed there, crouched in the mud, trying not to vomit from fear. I waited and waited. I don't know how long. Every time the wind rustled the leaves or a branch snapped in the distance, I thought he'd found me, but he never came. Eventually, I forced myself up and made a wide arc back toward the neighborhood, using a service trail I knew would take me to the far end of the street. I walked the final stretch of road in the complete silence. My clothes soaked through, skin freezing, body trembling. I got home, locked the door, sat on the floor for hours. I couldn't speak, couldn't think. I just sat there, letting the silence wrap around me like a blanket. I never saw him again. I never heard about anyone being arrested. No stories in the paper. No cops knocking on my door. Nothing. And I never figured out what that sound was either. That awful wailing screech from the woods. Maybe it was unrelated. Maybe it wasn't. I've gone over every theory. A drugged-up lunatic. Some kind of deranged game. A planned attack that went wrong. None of it explains everything. None of it brings peace. I still live in that house. I still walk that park. But I don't go out when it rains anymore. And when I do sleep, I leave the lights on.